January 17th, 1991. Baghdad, Iraq. The tranquil Arabian night is shattered by loud, roaring explosions. Iraqi gun batteries suddenly light up the sky, tracers making the scene appear like something out of Star Wars. Baghdad is the most heavily defended city in the world, and as images of the anti-aircraft fire filling the skies dominate TV sets around the globe, people are left wondering what, if anything, could fly through to the Iraqi capital and back unscathed. There was only one aircraft that could strike the city with impunity. It was the Lockheed F-117A Nighthawk, the so-called stealth fighter. Not really a fighter. The Nighthawk was actually a ground attack aircraft conceived at the time when the US expected to have to face a barrage of sophisticated Soviet defenses during the opening stages of World War III. Now, with its radar-defeating technology, it was taking a starring role in the campaign to remove Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait, reminding the Iraqi dictator that there was nowhere in his country that could not be hit by US air power. Emerging from the 1991 Gulf War with a reputation of being unstoppable and capable of extraordinary precision dropping laser-guided bombs, it's easy to forget that in the year before this incredible performance in the deserts, the F-117 was met with a high level of skepticism over its true capabilities. This came as a result of its baptism of fire in a prior US campaign, not in the deserts of the Middle East, but in the tropical Central American country of Panama. In today's episode, we'll look at the background, execution, and fallout of the Nighthawk's first mission. Welcome to Wars of the World. During the 1980s and the presidency of Ronald Reagan, US security policy was seemingly dominated with tackling two major threats to American society: preparing for a possible nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union and tackling the flow of drugs into the US. In both cases, Latin America was a major theater in which the US struggle against the spread of communism and the cartels producing the drugs was played out. But with the disastrous Vietnam War still very fresh in the minds of the American population, the US government and intelligence agencies were eager to find allies they could fund and supply to combat them, rather than send in their own troops. Enter Manuel Noriega of the Panamanian Defense Forces. Beginning in the late 1950s, Noriega was put on the CIA payroll in exchange for him using his position to gather intelligence on communist groups operating in South America. Later, as the drug problem in the US began to spiral out of control, he became a vital source of information on the cartels, which, given Panama's geographical location as a link between South and North America, was a major route for the flow of cocaine into the lucrative US drug market. But Panama was not just a vital logistics route for the cartels. Panama was also home to a key piece of US real estate in the form of the 51-mile-long Panama Canal, without which US ships would have to sail around the southern tip of the continent, adding weeks onto journey times. Completed in 1914, the canal was still US property, but an agreement was struck with Panamanian dictator Omar Torrijos to hand the canal over to Panama's control in the distant year 2000. When Torrijos was killed in a plane crash in 1981, Noriega promoted himself to general and later assumed the role of the de facto leader of Colombia in 1983. At first, this transition of power was largely uncontested by the United States, but as Noriega began to amass a small fortune in property, expensive jewelry, and even exotic animals, the US began to suspect he was taking bribes from the cartels. US investigations found that he was in fact embroiled much deeper in the Latin American drug world, and coupled with brutal crackdowns of dissidents in Panama, the US was forced to begin severing financial support to his government. Angered by this, and the growing hostility he was receiving from Washington, Noriega and his followers ramped up nationalist and anti-US sentiment in the country. He made speeches in which he predicted a conflict between Panama and the United States and vowed to fill the canal with bodies of dead Americans. He also strengthened ties with communist Cuba, which increasingly worried Washington, as Cuba was viewed as the door to Moscow in Latin America. For newly elected President George Bush, the final straw came on December 16, 1989, when U.S. Marine Lieutenant Robert Paz was killed by forces loyal to Noriega. Bush ordered a military operation to be undertaken to remove Noriega from power. Dubbed Just Cause, the operation would be the largest U.S. deployment since the Vietnam War, and involved 27,500 U.S. soldiers and Marines pitted against the Panamanian Defense Forces. Key to the operation would be securing the canal to keep it open to shipping and prevent Noriega from carrying out reprisals against American vessels. Another key objective was for an airborne assault, the largest since D-Day, on the airfield at Rio Hato in order to secure the runway for American use and to neutralize the elite Panamanian 7th Infantry Company stationed at the barracks there. In the latter case, the plan called for an airstrike to precede the airborne assault, taking them out before they could interfere in the Rangers' mission to secure the runway. For the US Air Force, this presented an ideal opportunity to demonstrate their newest weapon, their invisible weapon. The war in Vietnam came with some hard lessons for the US war machine, particularly when it came to fighting in the air. US pilots entered the arena supremely confident in their high-technology warplanes, but soon found themselves facing an intricate and effective North Vietnamese air defense system standing in their way, comprising of fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and perhaps most significantly, surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs. Climbing to high altitudes no longer offered protection, while flying down low in order to evade the SAM's targeting radars left aircraft vulnerable to all manner of guns, including small arms carried by infantry. The most worrying factor for the Americans in the wider scheme of things was that they knew this equipment supplied by the Soviet Union was not as capable as the ones retained by the Soviets for their own use, meaning Soviet air defenses would be even tougher to crack if the Cold War turned hot. US forces invested millions in developing ways to take out the threat from Soviet defenses, resulting in so-called hard and soft tactics. Hard tactics involved destroying the air defenses using missiles that homed in on the radar beams that would guide the SAMs, while a soft kill involved specialized jamming aircraft like the US Navy's EA-6B Prowler to blind the radars. However, neither method was perfect and had the same problem, in that it warned enemy radar operators that an attack was underway. US planners therefore decided that what was needed was an aircraft that could fly in undetected and plan to bomb on a target with pinpoint accuracy and escape before the enemy could respond. The response was the Stealth program, one of the most technically challenging projects of the Cold War, but one that could revolutionize warfare itself if successful. It was also, understandably, one of the most secret US projects undertaken, and one of the most expensive, even when the astronomical defense budgets of the Cold War are taken into consideration. Secrecy, however, was both a blessing and a burden for the project. On one hand, it kept the Soviets guessing as to the real capabilities of the aircraft being developed, and denied them the ability to create an effective counter, while on the other hand, the US taxpayer was being asked to pour money into something they knew almost nothing about. Into the 1980s, the Pentagon finally admitted they were test flying a stealth fighter and began drip-feeding the public tidbits of information, including a photograph of what would come to be known as the F-117 Nighthawk. Even this was designed to guard the secrets of the F-117, with both the F designation and the term fighter being used to disguise the aircraft's true ground attack role, it not actually having any air-to-air capability, while the photograph was deliberately blurred to hide key features. The F-117 initially became operational in 1983, flying from a remote airbase in Nevada. In 1986, the US undertook a brief bombing campaign against Colonel Gaddafi's Libya in response to his support of terrorism against the US. Gaddafi forces had been supplied and trained by the Soviet Union, and some of those in the US government and Air Force thought these strikes presented an ideal opportunity to test the F-117 in action. However, the F-117s were not included in the final strike force, as US Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger judged them too valuable an asset to risk attacking targets that could just as easily be taken out by conventional aircraft. Reportedly, the order came to cancel less than 1 hour before the F-117s were set to begin their flight to the UK, from where they would undertake the attack. Now, however, the F-117s were scheduled to play a leading role in the operation to eliminate Noriega. US commanders drew up a plan for the assault on Rio Hato that would see 2 F-117s attack the barracks housing the garrison, taking them out of the equation, just as some 837 troops of the 75th Ranger Regiment traveling aboard 13 C-130 Hercules would be parachuting in to secure the airfield. Heavy fire support would come from 2 AC-130 gunships, as well as 2 AH-6 Little Bird helicopters, and, like the F-117, another aircraft that would be making its combat debut, the AH-64 Apache. 2 more F-117s would attack homes owned by Noriega, including his beach house near the airfield at Rio Hato, and his mountain resort at La Escondida. Finally, another 2 F-117s would also be airborne, acting as spares should any of the main force suffer technical problems on the way to Panama from Nevada. The plan was presented to the Bush administration's Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, but rather than receiving a ringing endorsement for the plan, Cheney was somewhat puzzled by the choice of the F-117 for this assignment. He recognized that this was not the type of mission that the F-117 was intended for, and reportedly said to the chiefs of staff, quote, "Why the hell do you want to use the F-117? The last time I checked, there was no serious air defense threat." The response Cheney was given was that while the F-117's stealth characteristics weren't needed on this operation to evade SAMs or fighters, its ability to deliver weapons with pinpoint accuracy was going to be essential, and thus Cheney submitted. However, as preparations began in Nevada, the plan was being altered slightly. Instead of hitting the barracks directly, now the F-117s were tasked with putting their bombs 50 yards from the building. The reason for this was the fear of a public and international backlash against the operation, if possibly hundreds of Panamanian soldiers were killed in an airstrike. Instead, it was hoped the detonation of the bombs so close to their position would have a disorienting effect, bursting eardrums and leaving many of them concussed so they could be captured by the Rangers with little resistance. Then, just hours before they were due to take off on November 19th, 1989, the plan was altered again. Now, bombs were to be dropped 250 yards from the barracks, it being feared that the 50-foot detonation of the 2,000-pound weapons might cause the building to collapse and kill everyone inside anyway. The target was now a featureless open field adjacent to the 2 barrack buildings, which would make finding an exact spot for the Nighthawks to aim at and achieve the desired stunning effect extremely difficult. On the afternoon of December 19th, the first F-117s began taking off to begin their 5,200-mile round trip to Panama, an unusually long mission for the Nighthawk. The leading cell selected to drop their bombs outside the barracks at Rio Hato were some of the most experienced pilots on the F-117. Major Greg Feast, known as Beast to his fellow flyers, had won the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing Top Gun Award for bombing for 2 consecutive years, maintaining an incredible 100% hit rate. Supporting him was Major Dale Hanna, who would be using Feast's bomb detonation as a marker for locating his own aim point. To increase the stunning effect from the 2,000-pound weapons, their fuses were set to detonate after they had punched through the ground, meaning they would be kicking up huge amounts of earth, which would then come raining down on any of the Panamanian garrison unlucky enough to be outside. Lacking the fuel to reach Panama on their own, the strike force was supported by 2 KC-10A tankers from the Beale Air Force Base, California, that would top up the Nighthawks to and from the target. A total of 5 refuelings were required for the Nighthawks to fly south on a route that would take them between Mexico and Cuba, although the 2 spares returned home following the first hookup, given that the strike force appeared to be operating normally, and so were not needed. By the time the aircraft approached the Panamanian coastline, the strikes against Noriega's homes were called off, as intelligence had learned he was not there, and again, there were fears of a backlash if housekeeping staff or even Noriega's children were killed in an airstrike. This just left Feast and Hannah to go on alone into the night to attack Rio Hato. Given the lack of any sophisticated air defense system, it had been assumed the raid was going to essentially be akin to a simple training flight. However, events were conspiring against them. During his approach to Rio Hato, Feast determined that the prevailing left-to-right wind over the target might cause debris and smoke from his bomb to obscure Hannah's target area. He therefore announced that he was switching his attack to the barracks on the right and that Hannah should now attack on the left. Since the target area was obscured by cloud, they had to descend to a lower altitude before Feast could begin searching for his target area. Arriving over the airfield, the next obstacle concerned the high humidity, blurring the image produced by the Nighthawk's infrared targeting system, making identifying the target area extremely difficult. Knowing that the strike was being timed to coincide with the Rangers parachuting in, Feast was under enormous pressure to find the target and to drop his 2,000-pound bomb. With barely 7 seconds before he had to release his weapon, Feast quickly swung the crosshairs over to a known reference point in a last-ditch effort to find the target area, and believing he had done so, released his weapon, reporting to Hannah in the trailing F-117 that he had hit his target. Hannah therefore used his bomb to triangulate the position of where he should put his weapon and released it. Unfortunately, Feast had misidentified the buildings in the blurred image of his infrared camera and had actually bombed his original target area by mistake, resulting in Hannah's weapon landing far off from where it was planned to hit. Both aircraft then turned back out to sea to meet up with their tankers and begin the flight home, as the Rangers began parachuting onto the airfield. Unfortunately, more bad news was to come, as it was discovered later that the barracks were largely empty, as some 3 hours prior to the attack, Noriega had received word of a major US military operation getting underway, and that he was likely the target. As such, the garrison at Rio Hato manned their defensive positions and fought a fierce fight with the Rangers, although given the overwhelming fire support from the Apaches and the AC-130s, the Rangers were ultimately successful in capturing the airfield. Despite not having the stun effect that was intended, Rangers later reported that the detonations of the bombs did cause widespread confusion amongst the Panamanians, causing many of them to abandon their defensive positions, believing they were being bombed. Despite several other hiccups in the initiation phase, Operation Just Cause was a success. Noriega was ousted from power and went into hiding in the Vatican City embassy, remaining there for 10 days while the US Marines famously played loud rock music outside in an effort to get him to surrender, which he finally did on January 3rd, 1990. Flown back to the US as a prisoner of the Drug Enforcement Agency rather than a prisoner of war, he would spend 17 years in prison on charges that included drug smuggling and racketeering, before being extradited to France on similar charges, and then finally being returned to Panama to answer for his crimes while in power. He died while in prison on May 29, 2017. Secretary Cheney and the US Air Force were quick to label the F-117 strike a success, claiming that the aircraft performed exactly as expected. However, when journalists were allowed to visit Rio Hato, questions began to be asked if that was really the case, especially when a photograph appeared in the New York Times of a crater that was almost 1,000 feet from the barracks. This led to accusations that the F-117 was not the superweapon the Air Force had promised, but was instead an extremely expensive white elephant. These claims were only exacerbated by the level of secrecy surrounding the operation, and so, in order to try and restore public confidence in the weapon, more information on the aircraft's abilities were released to the press. An investigation into the mission concluded that environmental factors affecting the infrared targeting equipment made it difficult for the pilots to determine what they were seeing, and were largely to blame for Feast misidentifying the target area. Additionally, just how far away from the barracks the bombs were supposed to have been dropped was not clear, as several military leaders and politicians defending the F-117 gave at times wildly different figures in interviews with the press. Some in the press cynically accused the US Air Force of choosing to involve the F-117 in the operation solely to justify its enormous expense to the American people. But the Air Force commanders remained adamant that it was the aircraft's accuracy that was the deciding factor, and emphasized that while not landing where planned, the bombs did hit where they were aimed at. Regardless, through 1990, the F-117 found itself with the mission hanging like a heavy chain around its neck. Then, on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The time had arrived for the Nighthawk to prove its mettle. And there you have the story of the Nighthawk's first strike. Remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel, and leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.